So continuing on the theme of illustration, as everyone in this audience certainly well knows, 155 years ago in 1865, that manuscript that Michael was just talking about turned into the book. We went from Alice's Adventures Underground to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Since that time, there have been 1,463 illustrators who have created editions of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, or Through the Looking Glass, or both. As the most illustrated work of fiction in history, the Alice books are a perfect case study to trace the changes of the visual representation of Alice, her world, and even a bit of our own world. In an extended book chapter that I wrote that's going to appear next year in Alice in a World of Wonderlands, the English language editions, and my thanks to John Linsett for the opportunity to do that. The specific research question I explored was the challenge presented to every illustrator. What is it that I'm going to illustrate, especially given the rich possibilities of the 12 chapters just of Wonderland? To do this, I undertook a systematic and comprehensive exploration of each English language book edition of Wonderland to uncover the first appearance or significant change in a setting or a scene, the portrayal of a character, or the highlighting of a word or sentence or a phrase. There's no comprehensive catalog of all the illustrations that have ever been created. For now, let us estimate that there are probably at least 60,000 unique illustrations and vignettes that occur in all of these collective editions. So much as Alice descended down a rabbit hole, each illustrator descends down a rabbit hole. And what do they find? What do they choose to translate visually? And to do this, let's begin at the beginning, go on to the end, and then stop. Stephen Sondheim ends his play, Sunday in the Park with George, about the painter Seurat, with these lines: white, a blank page or canvas, so many possibilities. Now, we do not know why Lewis Carroll nor John Tenniel did not choose to illustrate Alice falling down the rabbit hole. But we do know why Carroll did not illustrate the tea party in the original manuscript. It was because the entire chapter didn't exist and was only added later for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So who did illustrate this and illustrate the scenes in the chapter? I look at illustrations in all of the chapters, but for today, we're only going to look at some of the illustrations of the Mad Tea Party scene as a case in point, to see what each illustrator brought to the table. So as a reminder, Tenniel had 3 different illustrations for the chapter. On the left, all the characters are sitting at the table. In the middle, the Hatter is singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat. And on the right, the Hatter and the March Hare are stuffing the dormouse into the teapot. The text did not mention the type of hat that the Hatter was wearing, or whether he even wore one at all, nor does the text mention the price of the hat. Tenniel chose to affix a top hat with a price tag of 10 6. 2 of the earliest English language editions after Tenniel were both approved by Carroll, but neither included the full text of the book and neither included the tea party scene. Siberry's was a sparsely illustrated play script, and the Wonderland birthday book was a desk calendar. It had 1 illustration per month, all drawn by JPM, each illustration captioned with a quote from either Wonderland or Looking Glass, occasionally misattributing the quote to the wrong book. Although JPM, in fact, did not include a full tea party scene, 2 characters from the tea party do make an appearance on the title page. In the center, the hat is in a spider web, which is odd since neither spiders nor webs appear in either of the 2 books. And off to the left, we see what is either a dormouse awake enough to be reading a book, or perhaps it was the learned mouse from the Pool of Tears in the caucus race. The first truly illustrated non-Tenniel edition was by Bridgman and Copeland. Copeland did only the frontispiece, which is in color. Bridgman paid more attention to the March Hare and his house than to the Tea Party. This is the first occurrence of an illustration of the March Hare's house as described in the text, with rabbit ears growing from the roof. Bridgman also included this charming vignette of an inexplicably endearing March Hare sitting inside a top hat and holding a steaming cup of tea. Now, in case you're wondering, the magic trick of pulling a rabbit out of the hat was well established by 1893, perhaps dating back as far as 1814 with Louis Comte, or perhaps a later magician, different magician, John Henry Anderson, who died in 1894, a year after this illustration appeared. Although it's not shown here, this edition was also the first to use dropped captions. Blanche McManus produced the first English language edition in 2 colors. For the first time, the Hatter's hats are stacked on top of his head, but with no price tag. The Hatter, the March Hare, and the Dormouse are all sitting in front of the table rather than behind it. We can also see the sole of one of the Hatter's shoes. Curiously, Alice is sitting in a high wingback chair, which is odd at a dinner table, and the chair underneath the other 3 characters are all different types of chairs. The time on the March Hare's watch appears to be 2 o'clock. This is the first time also that the March Hare's house is shown not close up, but in the far background, which you see in the upper left. You might also notice that the profile of the Hatter is quite similar to Tenniel's, except that McManus has the Hatter's nose turned up, where Tenniel's had the nose turned down. 11 of the 40 illustrations in Peter Newell's Alice were of scenes that were never illustrated before. Newell's Tea Party is a static mise-en-scene. The only differences from Tenniel are minor details, such as the March Hare's ears facing down rather than up. The Hatter's hat is more stovepipe than top hat. And Alice seems to be more fascinated rather than irritated or bored. We only see the nondescript back of the watch rather than its front. More significant is the illustration on the right rather. Newell was the first illustrator to picture the Dormouse's story about the 3 sisters at the bottom of the treacle well, and he poses and dresses the sisters as if they're ballet dancers. Fanny Cory added no new details. Minor changes in the upper left. The March Hare's jacket sports a plaid breast pocket. Note also that the profile is similar to Tenniel's. In the upper right, the time on the watch seems to be set at 12:10 and not at 1:30 as described in the text as being dinner time. And in the lower right, the Dormouse is shown upright and being awakened rather than asleep or being dumped into the teapot. Maria Kirk pictured the tea party scene in an extreme and tightly framed close-up, thus losing the perspective of the tea table being set for many people. She planted flowers in the foreground, which provides some perspective to an otherwise very flat image. Note again, the Hatter's profile remains much the same as Tenniel's, and I promise that I will not point this out again. Like McManus, J. Watson Davis's illustrations were in 2 colors, but Davis was clearly a significantly more accomplished artist. There are some marked differences from Tenniel. Tenniel oriented the frame horizontally with the picture extending beyond the frame to indicate the length of the table. Consistent with the text, Tenniel had had multiple place settings, but tellingly and likely purposely, there were no additional chairs for anyone to sit. Davis reorients the scene into this tight vertical. The table is perpendicular to the frame, creating the appearance of a very short table, thus losing the joke about let's all move on one place. Davis retains the top hat, but without a price tag. Alice's au courant dress is frilly with an abundant bow at her back and a hat-sized bow atop her head. The shape of the Dormouse's head and face is reminiscent of, but predates by about a decade, Ignatz the Mouse of Crazy Cat comic strips. Millicent Sowerby was the first edition published in English after the copyright expired. All the ones that I just showed were previously American editions, commonly called pirated editions. Sowerby's 12 brightly colored plates and some black and white illustrations. Alice wears a very bright and simple white dress with a pink belt and bow in the back. Kira is probably very happy to see that illustration. I'm not a milliner, so I cannot say what type of hat is on the hatter's head. Perhaps it's a high bowler, or it's a Homburg, or it's a Capello Romano. Sowerby adds a rose bush in the front, perhaps as a reference to the cards painting the roses in the next chapter of the Queen's Croquet Garden. And there were also other flowers in the back of the March Hare's garden. Thomas Maybank had multiple illustrations of the Mad Hatter scene, Mad Tea Party scene. On the top left, Alice is indistinctly tiptoeing into the scene, more observer than participant. She's blending into the background which is crowded and fussy. In the foreground, the table is set in a manner similar to other illustrations, save for the first appearance of a toast rack on the table. In the middle drawing, the Hatter is singing at the concert with the pianist, holding sheet music that says on the cover, "Twinkle, Twinkle, Number 3, T-Cycle." We see Maybank's potential influence on the work of later illustrators. We see the look of the Hatter predating both the illustrations of Gerard Hoffnung and Dr. Seuss's Grinch. Illustration on the right shows Alice deep in conversation. Compared to the illustration on the top left, the teapot is now turned in the opposite direction. This is also one of only 2 times where Maybank breaks the frame with the Hatter's hat and the ears poking above the frame line. It's also one of the few times Maybank used a stippling effect, perhaps employing a screen to do so, for the background. The perspective of Rackham's famous illustration is dramatically different from Tenniel and other predecessors. The point of view is looking down the long table, Alice at the head. She is sitting, as in McManus's illustration, in a wingback chair, which I continue to find odd. From this perspective, we can appreciate the table is set for many others, a fact rarely evident in most previous illustrations. Rackham's Alice is also older than all but McManus's Alice, but Rackham's Alice is prim and long-limbed, not McManus's elderly belle of the plantation. The Hatter's hands here are grotesquely elongated and disfigured, and as is often noted, the price on the hat changed for the first time. Best commented upon is the Hatter's extremely long, what is perhaps meant as a stereotypical characterization with the hooked nose. Charles Robinson showed the Hatter wearing his hat upside down. The Hatter and the Hare were also quick change artists. In the Carroll illustration on the left, the Hatter is wearing a polka-dotted bow tie. The March Hare's tie is striped. In the black and white illustration on the right, the Hatter wears a checkered long tie, and the March Hare has a polka-dotted ascot or perhaps an untied bow tie. Robinson also, for the first time in a UK illustration, illustrated the 3 sisters in the treacle well, picturing them as bald babies. Unlike Peter Newell, Robinson showed the sisters not just standing at the bottom of a treacle well, but rather with their bottoms immersed in the sticky liquid. On the left illustration, one of the sisters has the treacle falling off of her spoon. Another brings the spoon to her mouth. On the right, the third sister is drawing on a tablet, which is perhaps a reference to drawing liquid from a well, a visual pun of which Carroll himself might have approved. W.H. Walker's color illustration now has Alice as a decidedly blonde girl. The price on the Hatter's hat changes, as does the style. In the foreground, there's a picnic bench at the table rather than chairs, surely a first and probably for the last time that a bench shows up. There's a lone spoon resting on the bench. The fabric on the chair in which Alice is sitting has a repeated pattern of the face of the March Hare, with a wood decoration of the hare's head as the knob, and you also see the hare's house in the background. Keeping with the picnic setting on the upper, in the middle on the upper side, the black and white illustration is odd since the characters are not sitting at the table at all, but sitting on the ground with Alice's legs daintily crossed. In Walker's illustration of the treacle well on the right, there are 3 buckets on the ground labeled treacle, which is how we know that they're in a well. The 3 sisters sport t-shirt sized names on their fronts, and the 2 on the outside appear to be twins. Perhaps most distinctive of Walker's tea party scene is the first appearance of a rather large bat with the caption of the Hatter's song, "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat." So by this point, we know that Brinsley Le Fanu's was not the first to illustrate ears atop the March Hare's house, but I include his whimsical version because it's absolutely delightful, and it's the first time that the house is turned into a face, with heavy thatching on the roof resembling the hare, 2 round windows at the top for Alice's eyes peering down at Alice. There's a keystone above the door that serves as a nose, and the door of the house serves as the mouth. Harry Roundtree had perhaps the greatest number of illustrations, certainly the greatest number at the time. There were 8 just for this one chapter, including 2 vignettes of the March Hare. The Hatter appears in 2 scenes. On the left, his hat is a honeycomb with a bee perched in it. The signs over his shoulders point in opposite directions, forward and backward. He wears ear trumpets held aloft by a string across the top of his head, a feature that does not appear in some of his other illustrations, including the one on the right. On the right, the Hatter stands on a chair and pours tea on the head of the dormouse, who's sleeping on the same high back chair that he was at before. However, the Hatter is now standing on a low back chair that was previously opposite from and not next to the dormouse. And the March Hare holds a large knife with a pat of butter on it, but it looks like a sword is hanging over the dormouse's head. And I will observe that I just observed for the first time that there is also a bench in this scene that I had not noticed before. Every time I look at these illustrations, I see something else. I'm also noticing the treacle well in the upper right, in the illustration on the left, in the upper right, you see the treacle well. Also by Roundtree, as in the birthday book and Walker's editions, a bat makes an appearance in Roundtree, but in the left, here it is in flight, carrying a teapot on the back for the first time, like a tea tray in the sky. In the middle, we see Roundtree's treacle well, but here the 3 sisters are elfin nymphs, all carrying stoppered bottles of treacle on their backs. And then on the right, Roundtree also treated us to a rare close-up portrait of the dormouse's head submerged in the teapot. There are many editions that I must skip by today in the interest of time. But around this time, 1908, 1909, it becomes nearly impossible to say definitively whether an illustrator was truly the first to do something, not only because many English language editions started to emerge in rapid succession, but also because I limited my study just to those English language editions, but many non-English language illustrated editions started to appear. Nonetheless, it is possible to identify occurrences that, if not always unique, were at least interesting new features. So to finish up, I'm going to highlight just a few more editions to note contributions by somewhat later illustrators. Christian Yandell illustrated the first full Australian edition of Alice, but she included no Indigenous references to anything unique in Australian culture or landscape. There's not much new here except for another price change on the Hatter's hat to 12 6. And as Charlie Lovett notes, the Hatter's heart-shaped cufflinks. There's much to admire Vili Pagani's Alice. The frontispiece is of the Mad Tea Party, which offers a fresh perspective through an aerial view. This may be the first illustration where we really get a sense of a very long table on which there are many place settings, and where we can understand that the Hatter can indeed always be the one who's moving to get one space to get a clean cup as he moves clockwise. And again, notice the stacked hats that he is wearing. And we see the teapot right in front of him, but nothing near Alice. One of the best known illustrations from Ralph Steadman's highly original Alice was his tea party scene. On the table is a coffee pot rather than a teapot. The Hatter wears headphones, sunglasses with the Union Jack lenses, and a bowler with the price tag replaced by a slip of paper that reads, "Can you come back next week?" Joining the Hatter is a drug-addled March Hare. Above the scene, and above Alice in particular, the leaves on the trees are of a maze, symbolically reinforcing that she's in a situation from which escape will be difficult. Illustrations of another Australian artist, Charles Blackman, were not originally intended to be published as an edition of the book, though they later were. His were a series of paintings done over many years, and they were not really intended to provide any cohesive or literal viewpoint. Blackman made more paintings of the Tea Party scene than any other. This one from 1956 stands out. Alice and the White Rabbit, and not the March Hare, which is made apparent by the length and shape of the ears, are separated by a large table positioned perpendicularly. There's neither food nor a teapot on the table, only two extremely large cups, only one of which has a visible handle. With only two cups, it's clear that the other characters, especially the Hatter, who is not there, makes the other two characters either a figment of Alice's imagination or an observer of the scene. Anthony Brown provides a not often illustrated reference to the Hatter's riddle of why is the raven like a writing desk? Why Brown chose to reverse the order of those two objects from the riddle is a cause for speculation. Both panels include pieces of paper on the floor in nearly identical positions. The one under the desk on the left has only indecipherable handwriting, but below the raven is a sheet of music. I'm unsure if there's any real tune, but the final bar does appear to be for the internal lyric, "Like a diamond in the sky." Notable also here is the shadow of the writing desk that appears below and behind the raven. In the tea party scene on the right, the items on the table include a teapot with a cat-shaped knob, a pocket watch on a plate along with tea cakes. On a second plate is a face created by two cherries for eyes, another fruit, perhaps an orange, for a nose, and a banana for a mouth. There's a sugar bowl in the front near the Hatter's right elbow in the shape of a well, which is no doubt a reference to the treacle well. The Hatter's bow tie seems to resemble a butterfly, another illustration first. And in the background behind the walls are two topiaries, one in the shape of a cat, the other in the shape of a rabbit. Oleg Lutchenko's multiple images of the scene center on the concept of time. The opening illustration on the left has the Hatter haplessly suspended from the hands of the clock of the dormouse who's sleeping atop the clock. The middle illustration shows a clock embedded in the top of Alice's chair, with even more clocks in the tree roots shown below ground level. And then the third illustration is on the right is of a pocket watch in which the March Hare has put the butter, and we see the butter draining out. The hours of the day are marked by the months, such as 1 o'clock being labeled January, the days of the week, and there are two nonsense styles, one that's just labeled whenever. Finally, Gavin O'Keefe's illustrations are interesting because they're more conceptual and less literal. On the left, the objects on the table include a watch with hands leaping off the face and resting on the tabletop, a two of hearts card in the shape of a teacup, and the dormouse halfway inside a top hat with a price tag that says cheap. In the illustration on the right, the face of the Hatter is the face of a watch. His eyes are hidden behind glasses, and the numbers are replaced by the months of the year. The numbers for the hours are replaced by the months of the year. The hat has no price, but has a different tag reading discounted. I also would note that one of the reasons I chose this is the cross-hatching that he uses and that he goes back to engraving those, though his were linoleum engravings. So as we can see, from the beginning, many illustrators accepted the challenge to illustrate Wonderland. For many illustrators, Alice is actually the holy grail. Once drawn and published, illustrations of Alice become immutably fixed on the page and in our minds, which is both the pleasure and the curse of the everlasting effect of John Tenniel's Alice illustrations. But we can see that other illustrators were able to break out over this past 155 years, some with changes that were evolutionary, some that were revolutionary, and some that were just pedestrian. At the best of them added brilliant new scenes. They not only changed our understanding of the book, but they also showed us time periods in which the illustrations, which they appeared. So after 155 years, nearly 1,500 illustrators have taken up this challenge to illustrate one or both Alice books. And we've seen so many creative opportunities still remain. And frankly, they always will. And I thank you for your time and attention.